evolutionist. Who here has heard of Richard Lewontin? Anybody? Okay, most of y'all. He said, our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is because we take the side of science, so-called science, in spite of the patent absurdities of some of its constructs. What? Did I say that right? Because we have a prior commitment to materialism. What does that mean? That means, despite what the scientific evidence says, we're going to have a commitment to materialism, to atheism. Why? Because we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. So in other words, that's throwing out the evidence in favor of the theory. He's feeding us a line of bull, I think. Psalm 14:4 says, have all the workers of iniquity no knowledge, who eat up my people as they eat bread, and cannot call upon the Lord? That sounds like Richard Lewontin. This is Julian Huxley, grandson of Darwin's bulldog, Thomas Huxley, and the father of secular humanism. He said in a keynote address in the 1959 Darwinian Centennial Conference, that was a conference to celebrate the 100th anniversary of Darwin's Origin of Species. He said, and I quote, Darwin pointed out that there is no supernatural designer. Since natural selection could account for any known form of life, there was no room for a supernatural agency in its evolution. Therefore, he's dismissing the idea of theistic evolution. Therefore, we can dismiss entirely the idea of a supernatural overriding mind, i.e. God, being responsible for the evolutionary process. I think he's a fool as well and feeding us a line of baloney. Because Scripture teaches us that all creatures were created after their own kind. In other words, Scripture teaches us that life was created. And God said, let the earth bring forth grass, let the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after its kind. Genesis 1:12. And God created all great whales, and every living creature that moves with the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind, Genesis 1:21. And Genesis 1:24 closes up by saying, and God said, let the earth bring forth the living creatures after his kind, cattle and creeping things, and the beast of the field after his kind. That doesn't sound like Richard Lewontin. That sounds more like the original founders of Harvard's philosophy. Atheists claim that natural selection is sufficient to explain life's creation. That means they believe nature has creative power, that nature created life. Is this true? What does natural selection actually say? Well, according to Dr. Carl Wieland, who's president of Creation Ministries International in Australia, formerly Answers in Genesis of Australia, he said, I quote, what natural selection actually does is get rid of genetic information. It is not capable of creating anything new. Like this beaver. He's cutting down a tree. He needs a, anybody see that? Okay. Dr. Carl Wieland. Natural selection is actually a creationist idea. Edward Blythe was the father of natural selection. According to Ian Taylor in his book, In the Minds of Men, he says, natural selection is really a straightforward common sense insight. A creationist, the chemist and zoologist Edward Blythe, who born in 1810, died 1873, he was a contemporary of Charles Darwin, wrote about this in 1835, long before Darwin released his book, Origin of Species. And this was before Darwin. And Darwin very likely co-opted, or shall I say, stole the idea from Edward Blythe. That's Edward Blythe. And that's from that book. Okay. This is what Edward Blythe has said. This is a quote from Edward Blythe from his Magazine of Natural History, from the Magazine of Natural History, Volume 8 from 1835. He said, and I quote, what is a species? What constitutes specific distinction? To which only the rational reply appears to be derived from a separate source. The same law which was intended by Providence, which is God, to keep up the typical qualities of a species can easily be converted by man into a means of raising different varieties, artificial selection, like dog breeding. They would naturally soon revert to the original type. So what's he actually saying here? Well, he's saying that there must be a guiding force behind selection. In other words, artificial selection, and those of you that breed dogs or cats or hamsters or horses, you know that you have to follow certain genetic guidelines when you breed. But if you let go of those guidelines and allow the animals to breed naturally, eventually they're going to revert to their original kind. We have 800 dog breeds that are recognized nowadays. Artificial selection works. You can actually get a Great Dane to breed with a Chihuahua if you can mechanically make them fit. But genetically, there's nothing wrong with it because they're both the same species. Look at people. Any two people in the world, presuming they're fertile, can have offspring no matter what racial group, so-called racial group, that you're from. Human-induced selective breeding in dog populations creates enormous genetic variation. But just as in natural selection, it's all from existing genetic information that's locked within the dog's genome. There is no new genetic information being created. That's from Creation Magazine, March 1996. In other words, natural selection cannot create anything new. Natural selection uses existing genetic information to work within the framework of nature. In other words, within certain environments. Some species genomes cannot survive in certain environments, like white-tailed, white-furred rabbits couldn't survive as well in a temperate zone like Colorado. Maybe in winter they could, but not year-round. And brown-furred rabbits couldn't survive in Alaska, up north of the Arctic Circle. So genetic variation has there is some validation here. Artificial selection works the same way. Natural selection reduces information. Here you have a family of dogs. Some of them are hairy, some of them smooth. Nature may select the smooth ones or the medium ones out for extinction. And what you have children that are produced that are only hairy. Result, loss of genes for short and medium length of hair, depending on the environment. So what does natural selection do? All organisms possess certain built-in traits or characteristics, which in a given environment gives that organism a greater chance of passing on all of its traits to the next generation, like the neck of a giraffe. Fred, you know about this, don't you? See, there we have our giraffe. He's standing there. He wants a drink of water. Okay? Now, first of all, we've got to look at the neck of the giraffe. It's a complex machine. A full-grown giraffe's heart weighs over 24 pounds and pumps 16 gallons of blood per minute. This is because the giraffe's heart is much larger than its head. A series of specially designed one-way backflow